Hey guys, how's it going? So today we're going to be talking about APIs. So if you don't know what an API is, just break it down a little bit. First of all, Facebook. Facebook has all the information of everyone in the entire world. And let's say they want like advertisers or apps and other websites to use this information, or at least some of this information that they have. So how do they get this information to people securely? This is what we call an API. So something to note about an API is it's kind of like a doorway. You make certain calls and you retrieve certain information. But also you need a key or a token to actually get that information back and forth. So today we're going to be looking into how can we use an API inside of Xcode with Swift UI. Now of course I'm using Swift UI here just because the UI is not the part that we're focusing on, but it's faster. So first off, in order to get started working with an API, we need to figure out which API we want to use. They all more or less act in the same way. You might have to pay attention to certain things here and there, but today we're going to be looking at this API called Unsplash. It's basically a way for photographers to share beautiful photos, but they have an amazing API and it's a great basis to get started. And so first off, in order to get started, you need to get your key, right? In order to access the API. So that's where you need to go to your account, create an account with them, and then you go to unsplash.com/developers, or if you go to the account settings, you should be able to see that as well down there. And once you're finally here, you should be able to see your apps. So once you click on that, you can go ahead and create a new application to get started, or just use an application that's already there like I do. Now something else to remember here is Unsplash has full control of their API. So as you can see right here, you're allowed, at least starting off, you're allowed to make 50 requests per hour. And if you apply for production, you can make 5,000 requests per hour. Not all APIs have limits, but this one does. So you just kind of need to pay attention to how many times you are calling the API and whatnot. Then down here, you should be able to see keys. And like I said, it's a doorway, so you need to have certain keys. First off, we have the access key and then the secret key. So this access key is first off the thing that's going to go in your client. All right, so this part needs to be clearly explained. So first off, we have the access key. So the access key, or sometimes called the client ID or client key, is the thing that's going to go on people's iPhones, for example, or on your website. And it's generally okay to have an access key into your client. And that's because all you're really doing is getting information. If you don't want people like bogging up your requests and stuff like that, then you want to try protecting your access key as much as possible. But the access key is for getting information, whereas the secret key will never go on the client. The secret key will always be on your backend. It will always be on some Heroku server or something like that. And that's because with the secret key, people can actually push data into Unsplash's database. And so they're very protective about that. And so those are kind of things that you need to keep in mind when you're developing your application, what to keep public and what to keep private. So now going back into our application here, we want to actually start working with this data that we have. So how do we start working with it? First, you go over to the documentation. Every API should have its own documentation, and so you shouldn't need to worry about any of that. It should have things pretty clearly laid out. Unsplash has really good documentation. Stripe has really good documentation. PayPal has horrible documentation. It's kind of there, but they don't really update it too often, and that's kind of the issue that you need to look out with every now and then with APIs. But either way, we have Unsplash here, and their documentation's up to date, and it works great. That rhymed. Now, how do we read this documentation? This was like the number one thing that a lot of people get confused at when they're first starting off. But basically, you have the getting started guide up here. It'll basically tell you, hey, here's some SDKs, here's how you would register your application, yada, yada, yada. We won't worry about SDKs. SDKs are basically a way for you to interact with the API a bit more easily, but the problem with the SDKs is sometimes they're not up to date as fast as possible. What we are going to do though is let's look over to the table of contents here, and we can kind of see what we want to do. We're not going to be putting data into Unsplash's database today, not at all. We're going to be grabbing some data today. So first off, let's go down to search photos, and we should be able to see this data here. So this is generally how things are going to be laid out with an API. We have the get. So this is letting you know that if you use /search/photos, you're going to be getting information rather than post, which is putting information into Unsplash. Then down here, we have some parameters. So as we're trying to grab some information, Unsplash requires a few things from us. So first off, you'll be able to see, of course, we need a search term, or as it's called here, a query. Then there's some other optional things that you can put in here as well. So page per page, order by, yada, yada, yada. And then just down here, you have like an example response. let's say this is what you call. It's page 1 and the query was office. This is generally how the data would look. You have the total amount of results, you have the total amount of pages, then you go through and here are all of the results. And with these results, you should be able to see like the ID of the photo, or how many likes does it have, or who's the user behind it, and it has all the information of the user, stuff like that. So it's really helpful to know how to navigate documentation, because basically every company out there that has an API, they're going to clearly spell out how to get this information or how this information should be returned. And if it doesn't look like that, you're doing something wrong. So yeah, with all that said, let's go ahead and get started with grabbing some information and putting it into our application. So first off, let's go ahead and create an Xcode project. So go to Xcode, create a new Xcode project. And once we're here, we're gonna make it a SwiftUI application. So first I'll click App, and then we're gonna be using the SwiftUI interface. Of course, you can use UIKit. These principles should apply to both, but this is how I'm gonna be working with it today. Product name, we're just gonna call this Test Unsplash. And then let's also make this text a bit bigger before you guys yell at me. All right, so now that we're here at our application, let's go ahead and start setting things up a little bit. So first off, we're gonna create a couple groups. We're gonna have our models, a new group. This is going to be our views, and then we're gonna have our controllers. Okay, so first off with our views, let's put our content view inside of there. And all we're gonna really want from our content view is a way for us to call the controller. So let's go over here. Let's go to a controller. Let's create a new file. We're going to create a Swift file. This is going to be my search object controller. Then we go ahead and import SwiftUI. Then we call this class. We'll say search object controller colon, and then we'll make this an observed object, or I guess an observable object. And then once we're here, we're going to go ahead and create a shared version of this. So we're going to say static let shared equal search object controller, like so. And then inside of here, we're going to have a private init initializer here. And that way we only get the information, or we only call these functions through the shared protocol. And then of course we're working with the search today. So what I'm going to have is, let's go ahead and say @published var results equal, and then we're going to make this an array of what? It's going to be an array of a result. But what are we going to have in our result? So let's go over here to our models. Let's create a new file. And this way, we're going to have basically a model for how our result should look and what information should come back. So let's go ahead and import SwiftUI. And then we're going to have struct result. And this is going to be a codable. And then what do we want inside of a result? So our result is of course going to be an array of all the images that are returned through our search query. So let's go back over here to Unsplash, and we should be able to see that generally a result is going to have what? An ID. We can grab other information like a description maybe, and then maybe one of the URLs. We can go that route. And so let's go ahead and do that. So first off, we have our ID. So I'm going to say var ID colon, and this is going to be a string. And then we also need the description. So I'm going to say var description colon string. And I believe that's how they spelt it here, correct? Yes. And then lastly, in order to get one of these URLs, it's going to be a little bit more interesting. So first off, we have the raw. And then in order to get like a URL, it's going to be a little bit more interesting. So that's where we need to create another struct here, in which this is going to be my URLs colon, and then this is going to be also a codable. And then we have var, let's go back here. We have raw, full, small, and thumb. Let's go ahead and just work with small. So our small colon string. And then last but not least, we know that these results is actually embedded inside something. So we have total and results. So let's go one above this here, and we're going to say struct results colon, and then this is going to be a codable. And we're going to say var, let's go back over here. We have the total and results. So we're going to say total, in which this is going to be an integer that's returned. And then we also have the results. So this is going to be var results colon, and then we have the result. And then this is going to be an array of results. And let's make sure that, basically you want to make sure that the stuff that we write here matches that which is written here as well. So keep that in mind. So one last thing that we need to do is this URLs is created, but it's not hooked up to the result in any way. So we just want to say var URLs colon, and then we'll make this an array of URLs like so. And again, URLs, it matches whatever we have inside of the API itself. Okay, so now that we have our model created, let's go back over here to our controller. And we should be able to see that we have these different results. And so results here is going to be an array of results. So now that we have all of this set up, how are we actually going to fetch information from the API? So that's where we go ahead and start calling our URL. So let's go ahead and create a new function here. This is going to be func search. And then we want to create another variable up here. That's going to be app published var search text colon string will be equal to, and then just empty at the moment. And then we need to create the URL. So for the URL, let's go ahead and say let URL equal URL, open parentheses, in which this is going to be a string. Okay, so now what is the string that we're going to actually put in there? Let's go back over here, and we should be able to see the link in here with the response. So we see api.unsplash.com/search/photos, and then we have the query. So let's go ahead and just grab this here, this HTTPS request right here. And we're going to plug that right in here. Now we'll have to edit this a little bit because we don't want page in there. And then for this query, we don't want it to always be office. So we're going to go ahead and put in our search text in there. Okay, so now that we have our URL, we also want to make a URL request. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and say var request will be equal to a URL request, open parentheses, in which this is going to be putting the URL inside of there. And so this URL request is going to allow us to do a few extra things in terms of calling the API. First off, we want to add a token, right? And then we also want to add a few parameters. So this request is going to allow us to do that. And then right here, it's saying we can't have an optional type. So just add an exclamation mark because we know that it's never going to be empty. Then we say request.http method will be equal to, and then we're going to put get. Again, if you're putting something into the API, this would be post, all caps. Then we say request.setValue. And then this is really important. So this is where we start working with our key. So we need to go ahead and put in here our client-id. Make sure it's all spelled the exact same way. Then we do a space, then slash, open close parentheses, and this is where we're going to put our token. So I'm going to say var token will be equal to, and we're just going to grab the token that we have inside of our API. So we go to this access key right here. Let's go ahead and copy that to the clipboard, go back, and we just copy and paste that right in here. So now where we put this client ID, or sometimes it's also called a bearer. You really depends. Sometimes you have to go searching and really looking for what they want you to put this as. So keep that in mind. So this is not always going to be client ID. This could be bearer or client token. It depends on the API. But for Unsplash, it's client-ID. So then we put in here our token. And then for the HTTP field, this is going to be authorization. And that's about it for our request. So now let's start getting some information back. So all we need to do is say let task equal URL session dot shared dot data task with, and then we're going to put our URL request in which we put request. Then we need a completion handler, so let's go ahead and add that in there, in which it's going to return our data, our response, and an error. So first off, we want to test and make sure that we do have data. So let's go ahead and say guard let data equal, and then we'll say data, else we'll go ahead and return. We don't want our application crashing if the API doesn't return anything. Then once we do have that, we're going to say do. We say let res equal try. Then we say JSON decoder. So basically this response that we always get from the API is going to be in a JSON value. It's basically just a way that JavaScript organizes data. And so now we need to take this information and break it apart so that it's understandable to our application. So we're going to say JSON decoder, open close parentheses there, dot decode, and then decode from, and then we'll have this as a decodable. So this is where we say results.self. And then from the data, and that's going to be the data that we have right there. Oh, and then also with this, we need to catch. So let's go ahead and say do try catch, and then we'll say print error if there is an error. And then this should break apart the information to something that's readable to us. And so now we should be able to actually say self.results.append the contents of res.results. Sorry, this is contents of res.results. Okay, so now basically if you can remember, we have results here. This is inside of our model. We have the results. We're going into the results of the results. And then we're basically grabbing the ID, description, or the URL for each of these things. Now this task is not going to be called at the moment. So how do we call it? We say task.resume. And that's all we need to do in order to call this task. And all of the errors and whatnot should go away. And so now let's go ahead and try this search. So first off, I'm going to go over to the search text here, and I'm just going to search for flowers. Why not? So now in order to display information, we need to go over here to our content view, and we're going to create a list. Then inside of this list, we're going to have a for each statement. What are we going to iterate through? This is going to be here. So basically this list is going to be the table view. The for each statement will break apart all the data that we have into corresponding data pieces, and then we can build little views off of those data pieces, basically. Okay, so first off, what's the data that we're going to be using? So let's go ahead and say at observed object var search object controller colon, and then we'll say search object controller, or actually it will be equal to search object controller dot shared. So now we should be able to say our data will be search object controller dot results. And then for the ID, we say slash dot ID. And then for the content here, we need to get each of these results. So let's say result in, and we're going to display this information accordingly. And so this is backslash dot ID. So we're going through each of the results, we're grabbing them according to the ID, and we're going to build some views off of these results that we get. So first off, what are we getting from our results? Well, we have an ID, a description, and our URLs. So let's go ahead and just display our description, see if that works correctly. So we'll go ahead and put some text in here. We'll say result.description. And there we have our basic UI. It's nothing special, but it works. Now we actually need to call the function that we created earlier. So we need to say dot on appear. We're going to say search object controller dot, and then we say search. And that should search for the key term that we have. So let's go ahead, build and run this, and let's see what this returns. Okay, so now as you can see here, we ran it, but we actually ran into an issue. So let me go ahead and figure this out. So it's expected to decode array of any, but found a dictionary instead. Okay. And so it's actually having an issue with the string value of URLs because we put it as an array. So if we go back over here to our result, you'll see that I put an array of URLs, whereas this should just be URLs in and of itself. So let's try that again, and let's see if that fixes it. Okay, now it expected string value, but found nil instead when it was looking for the description. Okay, so now we have this other issue. This is something important to bring up because not all the information is going to be there when we're decoding an API. So with the description, for example, not everyone's going to add a description to their image. So let's go back over here to our result, and we'll just have to add our description as an optional. And then if we don't have a description, we're just going to have this say empty, just for tutorial purposes. And there you have it. So now we have the descriptions coming through. We have the first one. You can see that these three right here are empty, but you can see that generally we have returned images, or we have returned our search query. So there you have it. So basically, yeah, this was the only thing that fixed the error. You can see like having the error, that's why we have the do try catch. Like that's why this is so important, so that we can actually see what's going wrong. You definitely want to go even further into this. I'll show you kind of the coding challenge project that I'm looking at. One sec. Into the future, you can get way more complex. For example, this is kind of how I have things set up for a challenge that I did for a company. And basically we have the different results, We have all of the different, when we're decoding the JSON, we also have different containers going through. We decode if present, and we have default values if not decoded. And so these are kind of things that you have to look into and make sure that you are working with it once you get further along with things. But hopefully this was a good start. But anyway, with all that said, thank you all so much for watching. I encourage you all to take this one step further and actually load up the images that we're grabbing from the URL. For now though, this should be enough to get you going along in whatever endeavor you're trying to do. Anyway, there you guys have it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I encourage you all to take this one step further and load up the images that we grabbed. If you did like this video, give it a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm, and hope you guys have a wonderful day and a happy new year. Ciao.